Under the grey November sky of 1944, as snow gathered along the barbed wire, and the air hung heavy with the smell of burned diesel, a group of weary German prisoners shuffled into a U.S. Army POW camp near Saint-Lô, France. Their boots were caked in mud, their uniforms torn from days of retreat. Yet what awaited them was not what their officers had promised. Instead of fists or rifle butts, they were met with steaming mugs of coffee and cigarettes passed quietly through the wire. For the first time in months, some of them smiled, not knowing whether it was a trick, a humiliation, or something far stranger. Across the camp, American guards, men barely older than the prisoners, stood with their rifles slung low, chatting as if the war were happening on another planet. One soldier poured hot coffee for a captured German sergeant, who hesitated, staring into the cup like it might explode. The gesture seemed unreal in the middle of a world that had lost its mercy. The sergeant finally took a sip, his hands trembling. His captors nodded politely and moved on. The Americans offered no speeches, no gloating, only quiet decency. For the Germans, it was more unsettling than hatred itself. Word spread quickly through the makeshift huts. "The Americans treat us better than our own officers," one prisoner muttered. Some refused the coffee at first, convinced it was poison. Others, shivering in the cold, accepted, confused by the strange civility. The prisoners had been told that capture meant torment, that Allied soldiers were monsters bred on propaganda and revenge. Yet here they saw young men who handed out cigarettes instead of bullets, blankets instead of bayonets. That contradiction burrowed deep into their minds, sowing doubt and disbelief among men raised to think of the enemy as subhuman. To understand this moment, the quiet exchange of kindness, inside a world built on cruelty, one must step back to the chaotic months after D-Day. By late 1944, the Allied advance had shattered the German front across France. Over 300,000 German soldiers were captured between June and December. Camps sprang up overnight, fields of wire and canvas where enemy soldiers were processed, fed and interrogated. The U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare, feeding enemies while its own troops marched hungry and sleepless through the mud. Supplies were tight, tempers shorter, yet against all odds, the American command enforced one of the most humane prisoner policies in modern warfare. This policy was no accident. It stemmed from a belief drilled into Allied command long before the Normandy landings. That victory was not only about firepower, but also about moral strength. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of POWs, but the Americans went beyond compliance. They saw psychological value in compassion. To treat prisoners well was to undermine Nazi propaganda, to show the rank and file that surrender did not mean annihilation. It was also practical. Well-treated prisoners talked more during interrogation, revealing supply routes, troop movements, and morale conditions. Kindness, it turned out, was a weapon of intelligence. At Camp Lucky Strike, near Le Havre, guards recorded that captured Germans ate better than the civilians in France. Rations included coffee, white bread, meat, and even cigarettes, a luxury almost unknown in the collapsing Reich. Many guards were astonished at the gratitude they saw. One American corporal wrote home saying, "They thank us for every smoke like we saved their lives." For the prisoners, the warmth of American food and demeanor clashed violently with months of Nazi indoctrination. They began to question everything: Hitler's speeches, Goebbels' propaganda reels, even the purpose of the war itself. This was not universal, of course. Some German officers refused to believe the treatment was genuine, claiming it was a ploy for information. Others tried to enforce discipline inside the camps, punishing men who fraternized with the guards. But over time, as thousands of prisoners were moved from France to England and then to the United States, the same pattern emerged. Disbelief gave way to reluctant respect. By 1945, the U.S. held nearly 400,000 German POWs in camps across its homeland, from the plains of Texas to the pine forests of Minnesota. There they worked on farms, built fences, and mended roads. Local civilians sometimes shared meals with them. Small-town newspapers published stories of captured Germans who joined church choirs, played soccer with American kids, and even wrote home about the kindness of their captors. In a war that had reduced cities to ash, such stories were almost unbelievable. But to American command, they served a strategic purpose. Good treatment of POWs boosted the US's global image and created propaganda leverage against the Nazi regime. The War Department even distributed photographs of smiling German prisoners eating Thanksgiving dinner under guard. Each image told the same silent story. America was strong enough to show mercy. To the Germans, this mercy carried a different kind of weight. Many came from units shattered by retreat, young conscripts from the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe ground crews who had seen friends burned alive in tank turrets or crushed by artillery. When they arrived in American custody, they expected to be shot. Instead, they were told to wash, eat, and rest. Psychologists later noted that this disarming generosity often produced a stronger emotional impact than fear itself. It broke mental defenses, allowing prisoners to see the enemy as human and themselves as fallible. But there was another, less sentimental layer to the story. The Americans' compassion was disciplined, calculated. Guards were trained to maintain distance. No personal friendships, no political debates, no open sympathy. Every act of kindness was deliberate, part of a broader design to maintain order and extract information without coercion. Yet to the prisoners, it felt like grace in a world gone mad. By the time Christmas approached in 1944, captured Germans across Western Europe sat in barracks heated by Allied coal, writing letters home. Some asked their families to surrender if possible. Others begged to be captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets. The difference was stark. On the Eastern Front, surrender often meant execution or starvation. In American hands, it meant survival. Even Wehrmacht officers began to notice. One colonel, transferred from France to Oklahoma, told an interpreter, "Your victory is not only with tanks, but with your hearts." Still, many in the US public found it hard to accept. Letters poured into Washington, questioning why prisoners were being fed and clothed, while American boys died overseas. Newspapers debated the morality of treating enemies with decency. Yet the War Department stood firm, insisting that adherence to law and humanity separated democracy from barbarism. Behind closed doors, generals also understood that such treatment shaped the post-war order. Every prisoner who left an American camp alive carried a story that would ripple across Germany after the surrender. As snow fell over Europe that winter, the war raged on. In the Ardennes, Hitler prepared his last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Many of the German prisoners in Allied camps would soon hear of it from the guards, stunned that their comrades were still fighting. The Americans offered them cigarettes that night, the smoke curling into the freezing air like thin ghosts of the past. They didn't know it yet, but this strange mercy, coffee shared through barbed wire, laughter over stolen cigarettes, would leave a deeper mark than bullets or bombs. And soon, in the next phase of the war, that same unexpected generosity would become one of the Allies' most potent psychological weapons, reshaping not just how the enemy surrendered, but how they remembered. The revelation came quietly, not through orders or speeches, but through practice, through the routine of decency. What the Germans did not yet understand in those first weeks of captivity was that this kindness was not weakness. It was strategy. The Americans had developed what some officers called psychological dominance through fairness. It was a concept born not from sentiment, but from pragmatism. A calm prisoner was a cooperative prisoner, and a cooperative prisoner was a valuable source of intelligence. Beneath every smile, every cigarette, there was calculation, a silent understanding that compassion could achieve what coercion could not. Inside the POW camps, systems of control operated with military precision. Guard rotations were timed to prevent fatigue. Food rations followed exact Army quartermaster standards, 3,400 calories per day, including protein, vegetables, and coffee. Even the cigarettes were counted, issued not as favors but as psychological tools. A single smoke offered at the right moment could open a prisoner's mind more effectively than any interrogation room. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, had studied this, noting how prisoners responded to small human gestures after prolonged combat trauma. They called it controlled empathy, a weapon as subtle as it was effective. Technical manuals of the time laid out detailed procedures for handling prisoners, from medical inspections to mail censorship. Each step had purpose. The Army's Engineers Corps designed standardized camp layouts, double fences, watchtowers, drainage ditches, and wooden barracks spaced for airflow. These weren't just fortifications, they were statements of order. In a world collapsing into chaos, the Americans built islands of stability, and even their enemies noticed. The camp commandants, often men with engineering or logistics backgrounds, ensured that heating, sanitation, and water systems functioned smoothly. A German prisoner could feel the efficiency in the very structure surrounding him. It was discipline expressed through architecture. But beneath the surface, the camps were also laboratories of human behavior. Intelligence officers kept meticulous records of conversations, morale, and attitudes. Some prisoners, realizing the safety of their situation, began to talk freely. They discussed shortages back home, the failures of the Luftwaffe, or the mood of the German public. In return, the Americans maintained their steady civility. "We never raised our voices," recalled one interrogator. They broke themselves down. Over time, entire units of captured men became voluntary informants, sharing insights not out of fear, but out of respect. There were technical marvels at work. Two small details that made the machine of decency function. Army Signal Corps technicians installed shortwave radios in certain camps, allowing guards to receive real-time updates and coordinate logistics. Refrigeration units built by Carrier and Westinghouse kept food fresh, ensuring uniform rations even in summer heat. Engineers at General Electric helped design portable electric stoves for remote field kitchens. These were not luxuries. They were extensions of America's industrial advantage. The same factories that built bombers and tanks were also feeding prisoners. Each piece of machinery, each tool of comfort, was part of a vast ecosystem that projected power through stability. For the German prisoners, this was an education in contrasts. They came from a system where scarcity, fear, and hierarchy ruled every interaction. In American camps, they saw sergeants joking with privates, guards addressing them by name, and commanders who followed written regulations instead of instinct. One prisoner later wrote, "The Americans had laws even for mercy. We had none for cruelty." That realization broke something fundamental inside many of them. It replaced indoctrination with doubt. And doubt in war spreads like fire. The most striking case occurred during the processing of over 80,000 prisoners after the Normandy campaign. At Camp Atlanta in Nebraska, an entire regiment of captured soldiers was settled into clean barracks, given medical care, and provided work on nearby farms. When local farmers offered meals, many of the Germans were too stunned to eat. Within months, reports showed a visible shift in behavior. Discipline within the camps improved. Cooperation during interrogations rose by nearly 40%. The War Department quietly noted these figures. It was proof that compassion could be measured as a tactical gain. Meanwhile, in Europe, the lessons learned in the camps influenced how frontline units handled surrender. Infantry commanders began issuing field directives, emphasizing humane treatment, not only for ethical reasons but for psychological warfare. American leaflets dropped behind enemy lines promised life, food, and dignity to those who surrendered. It worked. Entire German platoons began giving up without resistance, carrying the leaflets folded in their pockets like lifelines. For many, the idea of captivity under Americans had transformed from terror into deliverance. The Germans at the front could not comprehend how their enemy managed such restraint. Nazi officers called it moral camouflage, a trick of propaganda. But even they began to see its effect. Prisoners returning from camps described a different America, disciplined, efficient, even merciful. These stories traveled by word of mouth across trenches and towns, eroding faith in Hitler's promises. The psychological front had shifted. Behind it all stood thousands of unsung engineers, cooks, medical officers, and technicians. The Army Service Forces maintained entire supply chains to keep POW camps functional. 18,000 cooks trained in field sanitation, 22,000 maintenance personnel repairing generators and vehicles, and over 100,000 tons of food transported monthly from depots to camp kitchens. Every plate of stew, every cup of coffee handed to a prisoner depended on that machinery. It was industrial compassion powered by logistics. In the interrogation huts, translators from the Military Intelligence Service used subtlety as their weapon. Instead of threats, they offered understanding. "You must be tired," they would begin. "Would you like a cigarette?" And then came the quiet conversation. Details of troop positions, shortages, officer names. Many prisoners, believing they were merely chatting, provided intelligence that saved American lives. The OSS called it the soft hand technique. It was warfare waged through tone of voice, but this quiet war of kindness reached its peak after one particular confrontation, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest in late 1944. Thousands of German soldiers, battered by rain and artillery, surrendered to U.S. forces. Those who expected vengeance found themselves sheltered, fed and treated for wounds. American medics, working knee-deep in mud, carried enemy wounded beside their own. The effect was electric. German field diaries captured after the battle described disbelief. "They feed us as if we were theirs." Others wrote of being ashamed by the treatment, feeling unworthy of the enemy's mercy. This became the true hidden weapon of the American approach. The Germans' ideological armor, the belief in racial and moral superiority, began to crumble under the weight of basic decency. For many, captivity became a mirror showing what their own system had denied them: dignity. As these men lay on cots, drinking American coffee and hearing jazz from camp radios, they began to imagine a different world, one where obedience to cruelty no longer made sense. Yet the Americans never saw this as pure altruism. Generals knew that post-war Germany would need men who had glimpsed another way of life. Each prisoner treated fairly was a potential builder of the peace to come. Each act of mercy was an investment in a future without revenge. Still, not all accepted it. Among the hardened SS captives, kindness was treated with suspicion, even hatred. They spat on food, cursed the guards, or mocked the gestures as weakness. But even among them, cracks appeared. A captured SS lieutenant later admitted, "They destroyed us without firing a shot. They made us see them as men." By early 1945, the system had perfected itself, logistical efficiency fused with moral authority. Cigarettes and coffee had become symbols of something far greater than hospitality. They were tools of conquest on the psychological front. The Americans had weaponized humanity, turning empathy into a mechanism of control. As the snow melted and the war neared its end, one final question lingered among the prisoners: what kind of nation treated its enemies like this? The answer would come soon in the ashes of a defeated Reich, when these same men returned home with memories not of torture or starvation, but of a cup of hot coffee offered through barbed wire. And when they stepped off the trains into a broken Germany, they carried with them something their captors had planned all along: the seed of transformation. But the full impact of that seed, how kindness reshaped a defeated nation, would only be seen after the guns fell silent, when mercy became America's most enduring victory. When the guns finally went quiet in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to skeletons of brick and ash. But inside the quiet barracks of American prisoner of war camps, a different kind of rebuilding had already begun. The German prisoners, once soldiers of a totalitarian empire, were now witnesses to something they had never experienced under the Reich: order without brutality, power without cruelty. And that memory would haunt them, guide them, and eventually help rebuild their shattered nation. In the final months of the war, the Americans' treatment of prisoners had evolved into a system so effective it drew admiration even from neutral observers. Red Cross officials visiting the camps noted how discipline was balanced by dignity. German POWs worked the fields, sang in camp choirs, studied English, and watched American newsreels under the supervision of guards who maintained strict fairness. For many, it was their first exposure to democracy, not through speeches but through lived experience. A prisoner could complain about a guard and see the complaint actually investigated. That simple act of justice was revolutionary for men raised under the Nazi system. The U.S. command understood the stakes. They knew these hundreds of thousands of men would one day return to Germany. How they remembered their captivity would shape the political landscape of post-war Europe. And so the policy of decency became not just a moral stance but a strategic pillar of reconstruction. American psychologists, including figures later involved in the Marshall Plan, studied prisoner behavior to understand how ideology could be replaced with civic responsibility. Their reports concluded that fair treatment created moral disarmament, a term used to describe how empathy could erode fanaticism. When the first transports of POWs returned to Germany in late 1946, they brought back stories that defied belief. In the ruins of Frankfurt and Munich, former prisoners told civilians how Americans had shared rations, allowed church services, and shown respect even in victory. Some described farm families in Kansas and Iowa who invited them to dinner after a day's labor. Others recalled learning carpentry, engineering, or language skills that would later help them find work in Reconstruction. Their words carried more weight than any propaganda leaflet ever could. They were living proof that the enemy had not been the monster they were told to fight. The impact rippled outward. Many ex-prisoners, particularly those who had been treated humanely in the United States, became leaders in local politics, business, and education. They carried within them an understanding of democracy forged not in classrooms but behind barbed wire. Historians would later trace portions of West Germany's civic revival to this generation of returnees. They called it the POW effect, a quiet transformation born from the paradox of captivity. Meanwhile, for the Americans who had served as guards, the experience left its own imprint. Some wrote home about the strange humanity of it all, how they had feared the Germans as monsters, only to find men who missed their families and prayed for peace. A few guards kept lifelong correspondences with former prisoners, exchanging letters about families, farms, and forgiveness. In 1952, a Kansas newspaper published a story about a German veteran who returned to visit the family that had hosted him as a laborer during captivity. He brought with him a small gift, a tin of German coffee, repaying a debt that began with an American cigarette. Strategically, the U.S. military viewed the experiment as a success. The humane treatment of POWs had achieved multiple objectives. It encouraged surrender during combat, produced valuable intelligence, and later facilitated political stability in occupied territories. In reports to Washington, military planners highlighted a lesson that would echo through decades of policy: the idea that moral superiority could be weaponized as effectively as technology. Compassion, they realized, could shape empires. This understanding carried forward into the Cold War. As new conflicts loomed in Korea and beyond, the Pentagon's training manuals continued to emphasize the psychological dimension of warfare: control through respect, dominance through order, persuasion through decency. The shadow of the Pin camps lingered in every clause. Even the Geneva Conventions of 1949 drew upon the lessons learned from the American handling of Axis prisoners, codifying humane treatment not just as a legal requirement but as a strategic advantage. For the Germans who had lived through both the Reich and the camps, the contrast was unforgettable. In post-war interviews, many spoke of the moment they first realized they had been lied to, that the enemy was more just, more disciplined, more human than the system they had served. One former Wehrmacht engineer, who later became a mayor in Bavaria, recalled, "It was in captivity that I first saw what freedom looked like. It looked like fairness." His words captured the core of America's unspoken triumph. The psychological divide between East and West Germany deepened this contrast. In Soviet-run camps, prisoners endured hunger, torture, and indoctrination. Many never returned. Those who did came home broken and silent, but men released from American custody spoke of discipline, work, and dignity. Their stories spread like underground literature, shaping opinions even in areas later occupied by the Soviets. The moral legacy of that contrast would persist throughout the Cold War, a silent, enduring propaganda victory for the West. Yet beneath the grand narrative lay the small, human gestures that defined the experience: the guard who shared his ration of sugar, the nurse who treated an enemy wound, the chaplain who prayed for both sides. These acts were rarely recorded, but they built a foundation of trust that no treaty could replicate. The historian Stephen Ambrose later called it the mercy that won peace. In the years that followed, many former prisoners returned to visit the United States. They stood once again at the sites of their captivity: Camp Swift, Camp Clinton, Camp McCoy, now overgrown with grass and silence. Some wept, others smiled and saluted the empty fields. They remembered the faces of guards long gone, the smell of coffee on cold mornings, and the realization that compassion had survived even in war. For them, that memory was proof that civilization had not died amid the smoke and fire of the 1940s. The lesson of those camps would echo through generations. When American soldiers deployed to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, military ethicists often invoked World War II's POW policy as the gold standard for moral conduct. It became a reminder that power without humanity corrodes, but humanity, when disciplined by strength, transforms. The coffee and cigarettes of 1944 were not small gestures after all, they were signals of a nation's character. As one German prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "They conquered us with tanks, but they changed us with kindness." His words, written in fading ink, captured the paradox at the heart of modern warfare, that the mightiest weapon is not the one that kills, but the one that convinces. And so in the ruins of Europe, where hatred once ruled and vengeance could have reigned, the Americans chose another path. Their victory was total, not because they destroyed their enemies, but because they redefined what victory meant. It was not the surrender of armies that marked the true end of the war, it was the surrender of hatred itself. In the end, the prisoners remembered not the fences, nor the guards, nor even the hunger. They remembered a single act repeated countless times across 1,000 camps. A hand extending through the wire, holding a cigarette, offering warmth to an enemy. A gesture small enough to be forgotten by history, but powerful enough to change it forever.